Hey fearsome friends, skinwalkers. They say you should refrain from even saying that word, but being in Spain, I think I'll be safe. One of these stories isn't true, but I wanted to include it because it's a good one. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. I was born and raised in Arizona, and am very mindful and fascinated by Navajo culture. I don't speak about skinwalkers often, out of respect for the very real fear and activity that's cultivated by discussing them. Now, I live in an apartment with my roommate, and we're not religious, but we are very into spirituality and the spiritual realm. She's been struggling with rejecting toxic and parasitic people in her life, and was in a deep meditation before she fell asleep, basically reflecting on how to expel intrusive thoughts caused by hateful people. However, whilst in this state of meditation, she saw two entities. Later on, she went to sleep and woke up around midnight in a state of sleep paralysis and saw a black entity in her room staring at her. Now, on my side of the apartment, I didn't know any of this was going on. I had fallen asleep around 11:30 and slipped into a lucid dream, paralytic state, which is not very common for me. My room looked exactly the same as it had when I fell asleep, but in the dream, my roommate opened the door and sat on my bed to try and soothe me during the sleep paralysis. But as she was talking, I shortly realized that her voice sounded robotic and choppy. It was either an entity posing as her, or it had taken control of her body. The thing tried to enter me by pretending to touch my face in a soothing manner, and I could feel its fingers trying to go into my mouth. I was inclined to bite though, because I knew I was in danger, but was also scared it was still her body and didn't want to hurt her hand. As soon as I felt it start to go into my mouth, I was literally shot out of the dream and was instantly wide awake. We think that maybe the pervasive thoughts she's been experiencing for so long from toxic situations was cast out of her and was looking for a new host. But I wouldn't accept it because of how in tune I am with her and just a general growth in confidence and awareness. I know this seems completely crazy, but could this have been some other type of entity? After reflecting, it felt like what everyone describes as skinwalkers, but it seemed slightly less sinister. It was an almost weak attempt at imitating my roommate to take some kind of life force from me. We're reeling a bit, but any thoughts are appreciated. I have always had a very deep respect for native spirituality, and in all of my learning about different traditions and important figures, I never thought I could ever come into contact with a piece of it. I didn't even think that it was a possibility that these animals were shapeshifters of any sort, until I recently was telling my brother about it, and he told me that it might be. I grew up in the central mountains of Idaho, in between several big mining towns from the late 1800s. And living here for most of my life, I know what the wildlife looks like, and I know what I would see in which time of year, except for a few encounters that I still can't explain. I was out early with my dad and grandpa to go and find a scrap pile to get some firewood from. It was about 7 or 8 in the morning, and we were on a tiny dirt path, miles away from any houses. And as we were driving, we turned a corner to see an animal sitting in the middle of the road. I would say that it was about the size of a large dog, but hunched close to the ground and completely black. It had a long tail that dragged on the ground, and when we pulled it up, it turned to look at us and had a small head with either small ears or no ears, but I couldn't see anything specific. After it saw us, it hopped off the trail into the bushes on the side of the road. And believe me when I tell you this, I have never in my life seen an animal that looked like this. We were all confused. On another occasion, I was out riding my ATV around sunset. I was by myself on some trails that I knew well, and I decided to explore a bit and took a different path, when suddenly it started to go up a steep hill with lots of washout. As I stopped to try and turn around, the scariest looking bird I had ever seen ran in front of me across the trail. Now there are a lot of wild chickens and turkeys, etc., but this was about the size of a chicken, and almost appeared as if the body was backwards, or if it was standing straight up. It was looking very skinny, and just not like a bird. I also couldn't see any visible wings, but it had a longer neck, and its head was bare like a turkey or a vulture's might be. I decided to finish my ride, turn around and went home. I don't know much about the native tribes that would have inhabited this area before the gold rush, but I do know that a lot of violence and death happened because of it, with the historical cemetery having over 100 unmarked graves. If anyone might be able to confirm or deny my theory, I would really appreciate it. So I read that it's not good to say the word, so I'm going to be replacing it with creature. For context, I love listening and talking about the creatures, and I love listening to stories about them. I live in Florida, and early yesterday morning I was woken up to my dad yelling for me to grab my gun as there was a coyote attacking the sandhill cranes that live on our property. I had heard them going crazy, but kind of slept through it. So I got up and ran to find my bullets, but I had been out the other day and had been meaning to go get more, so I silently cursed to myself and headed outside with my mum and dad empty-handed. The cranes had flown across the lake. We have 46 acres and 2 lakes within it, and across the lake by our second gate where the cranes were, I saw the coyote. It was grey and reddish and looked like some kind of dog, but it was a coyote, and it then disappeared into our woods. My dad told me to wait, as it's waiting for us to go away, so it can get its meal. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it run across a tiny land bridge on the lake into our other woods, and it was gone. Later that day, I was playing RDR2, when I heard a girl who lives with us talking kind of frantically to my mum. I heard the words, "A frickin' huge gator." So I went downstairs and heard that a gator was sunbathing on the bank of our lake. So me and my dad went down to look at it, and sure enough it was across the lake and lying in the sun. Then after a little while it moved into the lake and swam around a bit in the water. Later that day a big storm hit, and then today another thunderstorm hit. About a few hours ago my parents went out to pick up our food, and me and my brother and the girl stayed home. My brother then heard my mum say something about laundry to him from upstairs. He replied with an okay, and then made his way up to her room to see if she was there. She wasn't. So he called her up and she said she was still out with my dad. He kind of freaked out and asked me and the girl whether it was us messing with him, but of course it wasn't. Then a little while passed when the thought entered my mind that it could be a creature. We told my mum what happened, so the two of us saged the house, and now I'm here typing this. I'll update you if anything happens, but please respond with feedback on what to do, and if this is a creature, and what you think. I was just talking to my boyfriend about some weird stuff I saw as a kid. He's a hardcore believer in skinwalkers, and won't say it or even let me say it after it gets dark, in fear of attracting one. My story starts with coming back from the store with my family. In my village, an entire new neighbourhood was being built. Mind you, I live in an area that used to have a lot of forest around me, which has since been destroyed due to people building houses. There was a dirt gravel road in the middle of the woods from the main road that led to a shortcut to my house. I was maybe 9 or 10 at the time, and I distinctly remember sitting in the middle seat in the middle row of our family minivan, so I got a clear view in between the driver's seat and passenger seat. I was talking with my younger siblings and goofing off when I looked up to see it crouched on the road. It looked almost exactly like the picture you get when you Google the rake. It had pale grey skin, was freakishly slender, and it had eyes like reflectors. I freaked out and screamed out, saying something along the lines of, "What is that?" And both of my parents turned around and asked what I was talking about. I burst into tears and see it run over behind a tree. It was so tall, and I saw it peek from the tree a couple of times as I explained what it looked like to my mum whilst hysterical. My mum didn't believe me at all and got mad at me for trying to scare my siblings. Around that time, I used to watch a lot of those ghosts caught on tape type of stuff on YouTube, and I'd show my younger siblings, which resulted in many nightmares for them. My dad, on the other hand, said it was probably just a deer, but it looked nothing like a deer. I still remember those eyes. When we passed by the tree I saw it run behind, nothing was there. It was completely dark, so I thought I must have imagined it, until my dad told me when we got home that he'd seen something too. He told me he'd seen something out of the corner of his eye, but didn't get a good look since I'd started screaming and turned around to look at me. To this day it still scares me, and I never walk too close to the woods at night. My name is Eli, and I'm 22 years old now. I've always loved being outdoors and in the woods, and I remember about 9 years ago, when I was around 12 or 13, my family and I moved to Minnesota to help out my grandparents, as they were getting up there in age and couldn't run the farm like they used to. A year or so after the move, my 2 brothers and I got into the habit of running around the edge of the woods along the backsides of the property and exploring where we probably shouldn't. After school one day, me and my brothers got our stuff and made a 400 or 500 yard walk to the forest behind the house. My brothers decided to take off and run ahead, about another 300 yards ahead of me, play tackling and just being rambunctious teens, while I noticed a bundle of flowers that my grandmother would have loved. As I was looking at the flowers, I heard a bit of rustling in the woods about 15 or 20 feet to my right. I didn't think too much of it, because, it's the woods. So I shook my head and went to grab the bunch of flowers to give to my grandmother. But no sooner had I reached my hand out to grab them, I heard in my brother's voice someone call my name for help. It sounded just like my little brother, except it was off a little bit, like it was being played by a recording. I immediately froze, because as I looked up, I noticed my 2 brothers were a ways ahead of me, playing in the snow. I remember calling them to hurry up and come back with me to the house, and as I turned to run up to the house, I noticed a lone coyote moving in between some old beat-up trucks that my grandfather had parked in a pasture on the edge of the woods. But this coyote was considerably larger than anyone I'd seen up until that point, and what struck me as odd was that this coyote looked like it had gotten hit by a car. I swear that when it moved around the trucks, it looked like it had its paws on the side of the truck, like it was trying to look over it. I couldn't help myself and yelled, "Hey!" to it, and we sat for about a minute or less just staring at each other, before I could turn and start back walking to my house. I watched this thing lean around the truck and say in my brother's voice again, "Hey." And when this happened, I yelled for my brothers and booked it to the porch of the house. As my brothers caught up to me, they noticed how pale I was and asked what was wrong. So I told them I'd seen a mountain lion, scared of being ridiculed for seeing something so ridiculously frightening. Later that night, I was looking around the internet and found some other encounters by people all over the United States having similar stories, and came across an article about the Skinwalkers, which was both terrifying and interesting. This isn't the only encounter I've had with such entities, though. I just wanted to get my story out there as a bit of a warning that there are things out there that don't really make sense to the human mind. Now, I'm a pretty avid outdoorsman, despite the events that have plagued me in the past. And the events in this encounter happened not too far inside the Ocala National Forest in central Florida. A skinwalker in Florida. Go figure, right? So the day started with a phone call from my brother, who was asking if I wanted to go hiking in the national forest outside of our town, then spend the night out there in hopes of doing a little fishing and roasting some marshmallows over a fire. So it was me, my brother, and his girlfriend, who I see as my loving little sister, and it was just going to be a night of chilling. We left town and headed to the woods pretty early that day, around 3 in the afternoon. We had gotten to our spot in the woods after 2 hours of riding around, trying to find the perfect spot to set a tent. My brother, sister, and I decided to start the day with some fishing, so we grabbed our rods and a tackle box and headed for a little stream about a 1/4 mile from our camping spot. As we came close to the stream, we noticed an awful smell like rotten meat. When we came up to the river, we found the source of the smell, an abundance of dead fish all around the edge of the stream, and we saw the water had a nasty rust-coloured tint to it. When we were done gagging at the sight and smell of what was in front of us, a huge sense of dread washed over with an uncomfortable feeling of being watched. My sister noticed and asked what was wrong, so I played it off with a joke and suggested we go make the fire and set up the tent. I shrugged it off, not wanting to frighten her. After another 30-minute hike from the stream back to the campground, my brother and sister started collecting wood for the fire, while I started to set the tent up. I set it up around the same time they'd come back with enough wood to have a fire last a long while. So we got the fire lit, and I admit it was a damn good fire, so we decided to start roasting some marshmallows. Before I could eat any, though, I had to take a leak, so I told them I was going to step into the woods for a second to pee. I walked about 30 feet into the woods and started to relieve myself when I heard my sister say, "Hello." Finding this extremely odd, I looked around and didn't see anyone or anything, so I went back to my business. As I was zipping up my zipper, I heard her say again, "Hey." Thinking they were pranking me, I rushed back to the campground to find them still roasting marshmallows over the fire. Kinda freaked out, I asked them if they were messing with me, to which they frowned and explained that they've been in the same spot since I went into the woods. Now terrified, they saw how ghost white I had turned and asked me if everything was all right. So I told them what I heard, and they suggested that we go into the tent and get to bed early. So that's what we did. After already taking a while to fall asleep, I woke up in the middle of the night to underbrush crunching right outside our tent, and the horrible smell from earlier was back. Worse than before, for fear of scaring the hell out of my brother and sister, I decided not to wake them up. As I sat there shaking and sweating, I noticed the sound of twigs snapping had stopped, and I began to hear what I could swear was loud, raspy and heavy breathing, like something was trying to sniff out our tent. I quietly tried to lay back down and cover my ears so I couldn't hear the breathing anymore, and eventually I fell back to sleep. The next morning we woke up late, so we decided to start packing up our belongings and head home. When we got out of the tent, the first thing we noticed was that our cooler had been torn up and thrown upside down against a tree with everything that was in it, and was strewn throughout the campsite. Another thing I noticed when I was rolling the tent up was a ton of footprints. Weird footprints that almost looked like normal, except for obvious claw marks above each toe. Once I'd spotted these, I hurried up putting the tent in my truck and got my brother and sister and myself out of there as quickly as I safely could. As of yet, I haven't been back camping in any kind of woods, and I can't imagine coming across another one of these things. I am a Northeastern American from a Norwegian-German heritage, so I was raised very spiritually and have some ghosts of my own. I know, laugh at that statement if you want, but I have photos, videos, friends, family, exes, roommates, and a girlfriend that has seen and experienced them too. So my Seneca best friend took me to see a shaman when I was a teenager, after having some activity that people would call paranormal. And his father's friend, who is also a shaman, said that I carry a lot of good energy, but attract bad energy all the time. So last Sunday morning, February 21st, 2021, my girlfriend and I were in my living room, playing a Gundam game. Whilst playing, we noticed my cat Ebby acting strangely, staring out of the back door all night, raising her hackles from time to time, and just glaring at the door intently. It got to around 4 p.m, and Ebby freaked out and ran into the hallway, hissing and growling. Now this is highly unusual, because Ebby doesn't make noise. She doesn't even purr unless she's with me, and she only meows when I make sandwiches, because she wants to eat the lunch meat. So when she freaked out like this, it shook me up, and Sam and I were curious and freaked out. I got up to calm Ebby down when I heard my roommate Andre had woken up from all the noise. I took a few steps towards Ebby when Sam suddenly cried out my name. I looked over to the sliding glass door that sits behind the couch that we were just sitting on, and what I saw still terrifies me to this day. Sam was bolting past me as I saw two blood-orange eyes staring in through the glass and looking right at me and Sam. Once Sam was out of the room and running down the hallway, the eyes locked onto me. And that is mostly all I saw. I'm not a short or skinny man at all. I weigh 230 pounds, work out and work in construction part-time from my main job, so I'm not a small guy. But the eyes on this thing stood at least half a head taller than me, maybe in the 6'4", 6'5" range. I didn't see much of the body either. But what made me run was when the eyes went down to about chest level and then moved to the right. I'm a self-defense advocate as well. I have pistols, shotguns, revolvers, hunting rifles for when I go hunting, and my dad's AR. But I ignored all of them, instead bolting for the same hallway that everyone else had run into. I nearly slammed into Andre, trying to figure out what to do, and pushed Sam into the bathroom in the process. It was the only room with no windows, so I figured it would be safer, and then I finally went for my guns. Within seconds, Andre and I each had a gun and called 911, and that's when we were in for the scariest 7 minutes of our lives. Now, I barely know anything about these witches, and the only reason why I call them witches is because I don't reference anything Native American by name. I learned that lesson in Seneca lands doing stupid white people stuff. I'd never researched them, but all three of us were cowered in a half bathroom hearing scratching, knocking, someone running on the roof, banging and something that sounded like knocking on the walls, until it suddenly stopped and we heard wailing from a siren up close. The police showed up quickly, and they said that when the officer had arrived, he'd seen a figure banging on the side of the house before it took off. So he pursued it only to find it dip down the alley right next to our house. When he pulled his Suburban into the alley though, he'd lost him. The police had us answer questions and investigated the house. They left around 6:30ish, and Sam stayed at my place, too scared to go home. Andre called out to work, and I went in late. And as I was working, my buddy Ray asked me what had happened the night before. I was panicking inside and was really confused, so I asked him what he meant, and he said, "You just seem messed up, man." I described to him what happened without naming what I know I saw, and he outright said, "Let me ride home with you." So we went home and he got out looking at my garden. He asked how my herbs were growing when we were in my backyard, and I said, "Ready to be picked soon, why?" He didn't say anything, just pointed at the trays I grow my herbs in, and they were completely trashed and had been picked clean. He chuckled and said, "You've got nothing to fear. He wasn't here for you, he was here for them. One of you must have done something in the past for him to need to scare you all. If you were his targets, it would have been much worse." And with that we walked around the house as he told me to smell the air. He said that if I or anyone else was targeted, we would have noticed rot and decay. And then he found freshly turned soil and dug at it. We found a wad of dried corn husk near where the herbs were, and he said that we should leave it as removing it is bad. It had no ill intentions, but tonight I'm burning some sage and cedar, and tomorrow I'll plant some more herbs, specifically those it likes, but away from the doors and windows, so we don't get scared by him. I'm absolutely terrified writing this post. So we were out checking on an escaped rooster in the woods that backed onto our house. We had taken a very shanty flashlight and thankfully spotted him right away, but something about these woods just weren't right and felt off. I'd had a terrifying encounter in those woods before that to this day I still can't explain, but was witnessed by the police, my neighbour and my girlfriend, and that's a story for another day. So we were walking back after successfully locating our escaped rooster that was perched in the distance on a tree branch just beyond the woodline, and that was when we noticed a grey, misty thing in the sky, almost like an owl. The problem was, though, we both witnessed it vanish into thin air, and we went inside for a moment to check on our daughter. When we went back out to figure out what the hell was going on, we found nothing, or so we thought. The house next door had built a shed with a motion detection light in their front lawn. We were standing on our front lawn looking into the trees with a better flashlight this time, expecting to see an owl. Instead, the motion light kicked on, and we saw a dog. Well, sort of. It was something on 4 legs, and it ran into the distance, looking back a few times as it went. The problem with this, though, is that the dog would have had to have been standing still for at least 10 minutes to not re-trigger the motion light, as it stays on after being activated for 10 minutes. It's like the dog had appeared out of thin air in front of the motion light. But the strangest part, though, was that it appeared right where we'd seen the misty air creature earlier. Any thoughts? Because I'm completely terrified. I don't really know what I encountered, but I'm hoping someone listening will. When I thought about this, the first thing I thought of was a skinwalker, but I hope someone can tell me what it is. Now keep in mind that this happened when I was 9, and I didn't know much of anything. It all happened when I lived in Arizona with my aunt, my uncle, my 2 sisters, and my aunt's boyfriend. My uncle, aunt, and her boyfriend had gone to work and wouldn't be home until about 1 a.m. At the house was my 7-year-old sister and my other 10-year-old sister, and we were just relaxing and doing our own thing until they got back. We lived in a bit of a bad neighborhood, so I always made sure to keep everything locked at night. Time that night flew by and was now 11 p.m. I did a check around the house to make sure everything was locked, then just sat down and chilled for a bit. My other sisters were asleep, and I was messing around on my phone, looking at YouTube videos and whatnot, when suddenly there was a knock on the door. I wondered whether it was my family returning, so I checked the time. It was way too early for them to come back home, and I was just about to text my aunt, asking where they were, when I heard her on the other side of the door. "Hey sweetie, open the door. Sorry, I forgot my key." I was terrified. My aunt doesn't have a key. Also, my aunt told me every day that she would call me and ask me to open the door for them when they got back, but she hadn't called, nor does she own a key. I was really scared and felt like running upstairs, locking the door and calling the police. Yet I stood there and tentatively looked out of the window. I could see some sort of creature, some sort of thing. It was very tall, fat and hairy, but very bony. I knew it was tall because out of the peephole it was taller than the pillar that it was standing next to. At this point I was shaking with fear and bolted up the stairs. I went straight inside the room we were in, locked the door, and I called my aunt. I asked her if she could come home immediately, and when I asked her about it later, she said I was crying over the phone, but I don't remember if I was crying or not. She said the only reason she'd come home was because I sounded scared and was crying. Shortly after she was home and asked me what was wrong, I told her, but she said that she didn't know what it could have been. After that, they made sure to shorten their time at work and explained what happened to their bosses. My mum lived really close to us then, so she decided to stay with us until we moved. I don't know what I encountered, but Skinwalker was the first thing that came to mind. On Tuesday the 16th of Feb, around midnight, I was laying in bed. At the time, only my dad was home, but he was sleeping and I had been in my room for the past few hours, watching a speedrun, and nothing was out of the ordinary. I didn't have my headphones in at the time, so I could hear everything, and at that point all I could sense was the video on my laptop. Well, shortly after the clock rolled over to the next day, this putrid, horrid, rotten, sulphuric stench filled the room. I instantly thought that the toilet was backed up, but I went all over the house searching for the smell, and as far as I could tell it only came from my room, specifically by the windows overlooking the backyard. It was getting late, so I doused the room in air freshener and turned the fan on and went to sleep. Side note, I should mention that when I'm in my bed, my back faces the backyard windows. That night on Wednesday the 17th of Feb, I was in bed again, and right around midnight, the smell had returned. This time, no, there was scratching at my window, so I turned to look, and as I did, the scratching stopped, but the smell was still there. I got dressed and went outside to see if an animal had somehow gotten up to my window, as it isn't a second-story window, but is still about 10 feet off the ground. There were no tracks, and the smell was even worse out there, and only existed right outside my window. I was more spooked than the day before, but I decided it was just one of my neighbour's garbage cans scraping against the chain-link fence. Then last night, Thursday the 18th of February, when I was in bed, and again like clockwork, at midnight the scratching and smell returned. I was dead tired from work though, so I didn't have the energy to look into what was causing it, so I just went to sleep. Whilst asleep, I dreamed of my room. It wasn't sleep paralysis, as I've experienced that before, but the smell was worse than it had ever been, and I was almost throwing up. Then suddenly I saw that some creature that I had never seen before was standing on my windowsill. It looked like a deer, except it walked on its hind legs. Its front two were tucked in like how a dog acts when it wants a treat, and it hopped along my windowsill. Its skin was brown and patchy, but the eyes were what caught my attention the most. They were like headlights. There were no pupils or anything, just large beams of light, and I found myself staring at them. I don't know how long I did so, but eventually I mumbled a single word. Skinwalker. And everything disappeared and I woke up. I've no idea as to what is going to happen tonight. I have a dream catcher that a professor gave to me years ago, so I might hang that over my head. I've posted once before about the voices I've heard around my house, but this time I've come with a short collection of unidentified encounters that my family has had over the years. At the time this story took place, my grandpa was not a good man. He was really what you would call a disappointment. My mum told me about back when he was in his prime. He would hang out at the Res skate park with some friends, just overall having the time of his life. They would drink and just be teens. But one day, it said they saw a figure walking in the woods. They began to harass whoever it was and yell at them, thinking it was a person. But it gets a bit fuzzy here. He said that it began to chase them, to maybe 500 feet where they ended up behind the school in a little shed, with the door closed and hiding. I guess it saw them and ended up knocking around the shed and wouldn't leave. But he and his friends were in this shed until morning. Now before I was born, my mum had been in a similar situation to my grandpa's. One day my mum and aunt were hanging out in an empty house, drinking and just talking, when suddenly they heard a very loud cackle-like laugh. They stopped everything and waited to see if someone would come out. My aunt, being who she is, laughed and the cackling happened again. My mother freaked out and begged her to stop, when just then a beer bottle flew past my aunt's head and smashed into the back wall. I don't recall what she'd said she had done afterwards, but I'm assuming they ran. When my uncle was around 2 or 3, he had gone missing for a few hours, and they ended up finding him where the res meets the forest. They asked him what had happened, and he said, "I was playing with the little people." Now the little people are a legend that a lot of tribes have, but they are represented differently. My people portray them as tricksters, who also sometimes mean bad luck, or even death. And my people are very different from the Navajo and Algonquin, and I won't say we are similar, other than the big category we are thrown into. However, there's one thing that connects us together. I'm just not sure what it exactly is. I'm a Seminole native from Florida, and I was raised among one of the biggest reservations we have. I lived surrounded by lots of people, so I wasn't easily scared of whatever went bump in the night. I was probably around 14 or 15 when this happened, and at that age I was pretty introvert and isolated, only coming out of my room when called, and that was it. I'd maybe get food every now and then, but it wasn't often. So I was sitting in my room watching TV, when I heard my mum say, "Tay Gooch." That's my nickname and it means little girl. So I got up, walked out and asked what she needed. But she was confused as to why I had, as she hadn't called me at all, and told me to go back to my room. This happened a lot, ranging from my real name to my nickname being called. Another time I was sat with my mum when she asked me to go grab her a Diet Coke. I thought it was weird because I had only just gotten her one a minute ago, but I got up and got it regardless and handed it to her. She was confused. I was confused, and we started arguing about the damn Coke. She took it anyway, and at that point I began to question my mental health. But that was until my mum heard it too. One night we were sleeping on the floor together and having a rare family night, and my sister and I had already fallen asleep. My mum was still up, and I don't know what happened, but I woke up to her screaming for something to leave. I asked her what was going on, but since she was already mad, she told me to just go back to sleep. I later found out that she'd heard footsteps in the hallway, which absolutely terrifies me even to this day. Now I know this could have been something other than a skinwalker or wendigo, but according to law, wendigos will call to you in the voice of people you love, and I believe someone was testing the waters. So I'm 37, but was 36 at the time of this encounter, and have always been interested in the paranormal. But I'd like to emphasize that interested in the paranormal does not mean an outright believer. I'm certainly open to it, but more often than not I'll enter a situation with an agnostic attitude and instantly develop one of skepticism once I start assessing and evaluating everything. That being said, I do love a good mystery, and don't think for a moment that people who believe in such things are lying or are stupid. We all have our reasons for believing what we do. I was working 1.5 jobs in 2019. The half was an on-call assistant private investigator, and the main one was a security guard. We mainly did patrols for apartments, and a small handful of residential contracts. This particular event took place at 19th Avenue and Camelback, which if you're from Phoenix you know is a pretty shady part of town. The apartments I patrolled were just south of there. They were predominantly low-income tenants, half of whom were refugees from all over the globe. The complex was well known in the area for theft, violence, break-ins, drug dealing and so on. I liked patrolling it because I felt like I was helping people who genuinely needed it, and the vast majority of them were very grateful that I was there. I got to know many of them very well, and we would often talk and shoot the breeze before I had to start making my rounds again. One of the people I talked to was a native guy, who I won't name for obvious reasons. He was often on his balcony getting drunk and high, things which we were supposed to report, but forget it. As long as you weren't causing any trouble or making a lot of noise, I'm not going to say anything about it. He would usually say hi to me when I arrived on post, and we'd talk for a while, then I'd start my shift. I never had any real issues with the guy. He liked listening to his music, having a few beers and having a blunt or two, and seemed like a nice enough guy. He had a tattoo on his chest of some Kachina dolls, though I have no idea if they play into this encounter or not. Anyway, in the summer of 2019, I was doing my rounds, and around 8:30 p.m. I heard him chanting loudly in his native language. I went to see if he was okay, as he never did this before, but when I got there he was inside, so I kept doing my patrol until I heard it again not long after. I went back to his side of the complex and saw him and his pregnant fiancée and his son, whom I never met before, coming down the stairs, and he looked at me and said, "Hey man, follow me." When I was walking behind them, I saw what looked like a giant knife in the son's hand, but when we got to the parking lot, I could see it was just a very large feather, and his father had 2 smaller ones. When we entered the parking lot, I saw a native woman standing there who I had kicked out earlier for being loud and yelling at a guy who was the roommate of the native tenant. I'd seen him before and knew he lived there, but didn't know he was his roommate. I don't remember what they were arguing about this time, but she had her 2 sons with her now, 10 years old and maybe a 6-month-old in a stroller. They were going back and forth with each other, and the father and son began taking the feathers and rubbing them on the children's faces, whilst whispering in their language. At this point, the mother absolutely flipped out. "Don't you put that evil on my babies. get away from them, and so on. I was about to step in and tell them to stop, when they stood up and said, in a very guilty voice, "We aren't doing anything to hurt the baby. That's why I even brought the security guard to make sure everything is okay." To which she replied, "He doesn't even know what's going on." Truer words have never been spoken. She then said, "If you guys aren't doing anything wrong, then do it on your pregnant fiancé's belly." The dad said, "Okay," and turned to his son to whisper something in his ear. And then it was the kid's turn to flip out. "You're still evil," he yelled. "I'm half Christian and I'm not doing this," etc., etc., and took off running. The dad and his fiancée yelled at him to come back, and then he took off after them. I was stuck there trying to get the lady with the kids to leave, now for their own safety, and then I ran off looking for the dad and son. I didn't find them, so just assumed they'd left the property, and therefore weren't my problem anymore. But not long after, I saw a fresh blood trail and vomit on the sidewalk, and a knife nearby it, and walked back to the native guy's balcony, where I could now see him getting bandaged up by his fiancée due to having a huge gash on his forehead. I called the cops. I hated doing that, but now it was serious. They came and I explained everything that had happened, and they knocked on his door, but there was no reply. They told me there was nothing they could do, since it was a family issue, and the dad that was attacked didn't want to talk to them, which makes sense, I suppose, from their point of view. No charges were ever filed. The next day I spoke with a manager about the incident. He told me, "Oh, you mean Mike? Man, I've been keeping an eye on him. He moved here after he got let out of prison for manslaughter." Now, if any of you are familiar with the process for becoming a skinwalker, you know that one of the big steps to take in order to become one involves murder. I only saw the guy a few times afterwards, and we never spoke of the incident again, but it was always in the back of my mind whenever I saw him. For the record, I don't personally think people can turn into coyotes or wield magical powers. No disrespect intended to anyone at all. However, I do think that some people think they are capable of such things. Anyway, if someone who is more knowledgeable about these things and has any ideas, I'd love to hear them, particularly about the feathers and the kachina tattoos. I knew a native guy years ago who had a specific tattoo put on him by a family member in case he ever got into prison, so he couldn't be recruited by the Warrior Society, the native prison gang. Think their version of the Aryan Brotherhood. And always wondered if they had any hand in the whole Skinwalker thing in the Southwest. My father told me a story once, and I'll never forget it for a few reasons. I think it's the first story he ever told me as a child. It's also the story of how my grandfather died. But honestly, that isn't the reason. You hear stories on TV, or sometimes you overhear something in a public place. People talk about ghosts and aliens, and you think to yourself, that isn't real, you're making it up, or they're mistaken, or they're crazy. You just can't believe it. Until something happens. Something that brings it all together, connects the dots in a way you didn't think of before. Maybe it happens to you. Maybe you hear the same story again and again, happening to different people. But it doesn't take long for the world to become a lot bigger than you thought it was. As I said, this is a story my father told me, but I never believed it, even though he swore up and down it was true. It wasn't until I started clicking around the internet that I started to believe. I started to hear other stories just like the one my father told me, and it didn't take me long to believe in the rake. That's not what my father called it, of course. He's never used the internet in his life. He wouldn't know what the consensus has taken to naming it, when he chose to call it something other than it or that thing. He called it Skinwalker after an old Navajo tale his grandfather had told him, the way he told it to me. We were out hunting one night, he'd tell me. Coyotes. We'd kill 'em for $50 a skin. They lived on a dairy farm in Ohio. They'd kill calves sometimes. We'd do it every night because we needed the money. Sometimes while we were out, we'd come on a deer and kill it. Our landlord didn't mind, and it could feed our family for a few nights and save us some money. Anyway, we were done making our rounds and heading home. Walking because we didn't have a car or some four-wheeler back then. We'd cut through the woods, and that's when we came upon it. Blood everywhere, splattered on the trees, in the grass, in the creek. At first we figured it was a pack of coyotes. We'd seen it sometimes. They can't scavenge and start hunting deer or cattle. The worst was when they bred with feral dogs, but this wasn't like that. See, when a pack of dogs, or wolves, or coyotes attack something, they do it right. They'll pick off one that's weak or sick or old or just small. They'll hunt it, draw it into a corner, someplace it can't get out of, and they'll run it right to the biggest one, the alpha. And that deer will never see that alpha. It might hear it, but it won't see it. It will just notice that its throat is gone, and then it will drop dead. It's quick and clean. That wasn't what happened here. Something had run up on a den of deer. Coyotes won't attack a den, wolves neither, because they'd get too much of a fight. There were 3, I think, 3 bodies, just torn apart. You'd see a head here, a leg there, a torso there. Predators don't do that. They don't leave behind scraps. What had done this hadn't done it for food. It had done it for fun. But we didn't know that. We saw a bunch of carcasses, and we think it's something we gotta take care of. I remember my dad telling me to go home. He thought it was a pack of feral dogs. But I wasn't leaving him, and I damn sure wasn't walking through 2 miles of woods alone, with nothing but a .22 and a pocket knife. He was only 13 at the time, so a .22 rifle was about the only gun he could reliably use. Dad had the shotgun, and I wasn't going anywhere without it. It took me a while to convince him, but finally we began tracking whatever had done that. It wasn't hard either. We just followed the blood. Either that thing bled a deer before it got away, or it dragged one for a mile. I don't know. I know that I'd never seen my dad scared before that night. We started hearing noises. I've been in a lot of woods in my life. I've been all over the world, and ain't never heard noises like I heard that night. I heard things screaming. Deer, fox and rabbits, raccoons and birds, just scared. Keep in mind this is maybe 12 or 1 o'clock. Except the fox and some birds, nothing was supposed to even be awake. But they weren't just awake, they were moving. I saw flocks of birds that night fly straight into trees, just trying to get out of there. We came up on a pack of coyotes, nearly shot a couple, thinking it was what we were looking for us. But then we saw they were running towards us, and then straight past us. Didn't even notice. Then some deer did the same. Then rabbits, squirrels, foxes, even a couple of wild hogs. These things were supposed to be eating each other, and the only thing they cared about was getting out of there. We should have put it together, that maybe whatever we were tracking wasn't something we were supposed to see, and it wasn't something we could kill either. I don't know why we didn't just go home. I guess we were curious. I think that was my dad's nature, to go toward trouble, to fight. And knowing what I knew about what my father did during the war, my nature was to stay close to him. We finally got into an open valley. It was normally a soy field, but it wasn't in season, so it was just flat dirt. We saw the tracks then. A lot of the animals fleeing the forest had paved over the land. But where that deer blood was, nothing had taken a single step, like they were leaving it for us to find. The tracks were shallow. Whatever it was couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds, but that didn't mean much. A bobcat weighing 40 pounds wet nearly tore out my damn throat once. All that means is that it's quick and hard to hit. So we follow the tracks, and it doesn't take us long to find where it is. There's this old school house that sits on the top of a hill. Half of it had been ripped out by a tornado, but nobody lived there, not for a long time. We caught homeless people in there sometimes, or druggies looking for a safe place to shoot up. We figured maybe that was it. Maybe it was some sick kid riding a high, but we didn't think that for long. We get within 50 yards, and we hear this noise, a screeching kind of sound. It was sort of made up of two different sounds. One was a high-pitched screech, another was a low-pitched growl. It was making both at the same time. We got within 20 yards, and we heard this sound. I can remember thinking it was sounding like paper being torn apart, while someone was swinging water in a bucket back and forth. Dad looks at me, kneels down and whispers that I gotta stay behind him, 'cause we're about to corner him. Any animal will fight when it's cornered, especially when it's a predator. But we can tell by the tracks that it's not just one. He tells me it's probably a single feral dog, probably rabbit. The plan is to sneak up on it while it's eating, shoot it, and then keep shooting it until it don't move anymore, then slit its throat. If it gets to Dad, it's my job to shoot it or stab it to get it off him. So he walks up and I'm right behind him, just a tad to his side, so I can see what it is. I wish to this day I hadn't. It was leaning over a carcass, tears off its flesh and throws what it doesn't nibble at aside. There's blood all over the brick, glistening in the moonlight. It's pale white, human-looking, but not quite human. It had arms and legs like a human, but it sat like a monkey, hunched over. Its hands weren't normal. It had long fingers with claws at the end. So we see that, and my dad hesitates. He wasn't about to fire on a person. So he clears his throat to try to get it to turn around. I swear to God, all the noise just ceased. I ain't ever heard true silence before that, and not after it. But for 2 seconds, nothing. Nothing made any noise, which made it all the louder when it turned around, and made this shrill cry and jumped on my dad. He got a shot off. I think he missed. If he hit the thing, it didn't mind, but it was on him, and tears parts of him off. I started shooting it with a .22 point blank. I got off 5 rounds, and then I started hitting it with the gun butt, but it wasn't budging. It didn't even register that I was there. It clawed at my dad, taking off bits of his flesh. It started on his torso, ripping off the skin, his chest, then it moved up. It tore off his throat, it tore off his nose, his eyes, it scalped him. Then it started digging in and ripping off the bottom half of his jaw, the little bones that tube in your neck, then his ribs. I don't exactly remember what happened, but somehow my dad's knife ended up in this thing's shoulder, and my dad ended up on my back. I was running, and by God I was running faster than I'd ever run before or after, and it was following me. I end up back in the woods, opposite the ones we'd been in. I'm heading towards my landlord's house, 'cause it's half a mile away. I can hear this thing, screeching and moaning. I hear the tree branches crack and get thrown around. It sounds like someone's taking an axe to every single tree I pass. It's cracking so loud and often, but I just ain't looking back. Finally, I trip into gravel. I look up and there's my landlord and a bunch of his buddies, drinking around a campfire. I scream and cry and they come over. I'm telling them to call an ambulance, and he looks at me, and I'll never forget what he said. "What is that on your back?" he asked me. Just as he said it, he saw one of those god-awful flannel shirts my dad wore everywhere, It was what was left of my dad. Most of his head, his torso, but nothing after the waist. Suddenly we hear it, screeching. He grabs me, my dad gets thrown on the ground. I'm fighting him, crying, because I think we can still save him. But my dad had been gone before I ever picked him up. He has to pick me up and throw me inside before I come with him. He and his buddies were all inside, and they're locking doors and getting guns. The landlord's asking me what happened, but I just don't know what to tell him. He pieced enough of it all together to understand that there was something dangerous there. All the lights in the house are on, and someone called the cops. They'll be there, but in 15 minutes. We looked outside and saw it walk in front of the fire they'd made. Don't know what it is. One of them says it looks like an ape. Suddenly something goes through the window, and we shoot at it, but it ain't the thing. It's my landlord's dog. Just the body though, not its head or legs. We start pushing things in front of doors and windows when we hear something in the garage. I remember one of his friends saying that the doors were open, and we hear the metal and glass just get ripped apart. We put a couch and a TV in front of the door to the garage. It banged around some more, but then it got quiet. Not silent like it was before, but we could hear it move around some, and the guys were talking, making sure the guns were ready. Someone handed me a pistol. No sooner did I cock the hammer back, did we hear something shatter upstairs. Then we heard it screech again, except now it was louder, and it didn't echo and fade out, because it was inside. We all rushed to the one door leading upstairs, and we got to it just as the thing did. It opened it just a bit, and 4 or 5 men just slammed into it. It got its hand through. Someone with a shotgun took care of that. Put the barrel right up to its wrist and pulled the trigger. Cut its hand off clean. That only pissed it off though, and it started pushing on that door, clawing. We were on one side, pushing as best we could, and it was on the other doing the same. That wood just wasn't going to hold. So someone tells us to keep our heads down, when suddenly the top half of the door is just gone. My ears are ringing, and there are splinters everywhere. 2 or 3 of them just unloaded on the top of that door. I don't really know where it went after that. The police got there. I was still glued to that door, what was left of it, and the sun was up before they got me off of it. They put me in a hospital for a while. A lot of people talked to me, but I didn't talk back. Not for a long, long time. When I got back home, I got a job from the landlord, working on the farm. We didn't talk much, not about the thing, but I signed up for the army when I was 19, and he sat me down to drink some scotch as a send-off. I asked him right away what the police had told him. The story they went with was a wild animal, probably a wolf or maybe a bear that had migrated north. I asked him how they could say that when they had the hand. He looked at me, stunned, and tells me that the hand never made it back to the station. The cop who had it in his car drove into a tree and died on impact. The hand was never found, probably taken away by an animal. The cops, when they would acknowledge the hand existed at all, said it was simply the paw of a bear that looked like a human hand. I never talked to the landlord again. He went missing when I was in basic. The cops never found him. They said he owed some people some money and just ran away. But I don't think it's that simple. I never went back to those woods. I wouldn't even if I had the whole goddamn US Army at my back. But that was a lie. When my mother died, I don't think my father felt he had anything left, and that he might as well settle old scores. He went to those woods. He never came back. The FBI was called, and they did a show for everyone involved, but I knew they weren't really looking. I had to get one drunk and slip him a few 50s before he finally told me that they get a few calls about those woods every year, about someone up and vanishing. But that was all he wanted to tell me. Before he got up and left with the rest of his team, he wrote the rake onto a napkin. I didn't know what it meant until I searched for it on the internet. And honestly, I would have rather not known. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.